It was a hot and humid afternoon, typical of the Amazon, when my group of researchers and I embarked on an expedition to study the region's biodiversity. We had heard stories about an unexplored area where the forest seemed to close in on itself, creating a labyrinth of gigantic trees and winding rivers. The idea was to spend 2 weeks collecting samples and documenting wildlife. Little did we know that this would be a one-way trip for some of us. On the third day, we began to notice strange things. The sounds of the forest, which had once been a constant buzz of life, seemed to have vanished. The silence was oppressive, as if nature itself were watching us. Our equipment began to fail inexplicably. Compasses spun endlessly, radios emitted only static, and the GPS devices simply stopped working. It was then that we found the footprints. Large, deep, and with claw marks that didn't match any known animal in the region. At night, fear settled in. We heard noises around the camp, as if something were moving between the trees. No one slept well. In the morning, we discovered that one of our tents had been destroyed, and the colleague who was inside had vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, just a trail of blood leading into the forest. We decided to follow the trail, but soon realized we were being led to something much worse. What happened next was a nightmare. We found a clearing where the ground was covered with bones and animal remains. In the center stood an ancient structure made of moss-covered stones which seemed to emit a malignant energy. It was then that we saw it. A tall creature with scaly skin and eyes that glowed like embers. It moved too quickly to be real. And before we could react, another member of the group was dragged into the shadows. We ran, but the forest seemed to move against us. Trees twisted, blocking our path, and the air grew heavy, as though we were being suffocated. When we finally managed to escape that area, there were only 3 of us left. The rest of the group had disappeared, and I knew I would never see them again. After the disappearance of yet another group member, panic took hold of us. What remained of our group, now reduced to 3 people, decided to abandon the expedition and return to civilization. But the forest seemed to have other plans. The trails we had carefully marked were covered by dense vegetation, as if the Amazon was trying to prevent us from leaving. The sky, once clear, was now shrouded in thick fog that obscured our vision. We walked for hours, but it seemed that we were going in circles. With every turn, I hoped to see something familiar, but only found more trees and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then we heard a sound that made us stop dead in our tracks. A low, guttural moan coming from somewhere ahead. It was human but distorted, as if the person were in agony. We decided to investigate, driven by a mix of fear and hope of finding our missing colleague. What we found still haunts me. In a clearing, there was a figure crouched down facing away from us. Its movements were strange, as if it were chewing on something. When it turned around, I saw the face of one of the missing group members, but something was terribly wrong. Its eyes were completely black, and its mouth was covered in blood. It looked at us with a vacant expression, as if it did not recognize us, and then let out a scream that echoed through the forest. We ran again, but the creature pursued us with supernatural speed. Then we found a river. Without thinking twice, we jumped into the cold water and swam to the other shore. When we looked back, the creature was standing at the riverbank as if it could not cross. Its eyes stared at us for a moment before it vanished into the forest. We thought we were safe, but soon realized the river had taken us to an even stranger, our place. The vegetation was denser and the air felt charged with an oppressive energy. It was then that we found an abandoned cabin made of rotting wood and covered in moss. We decided to spend the night there since the sun was setting and we had no strength to continue. Inside the cabin, we found old journals and yellowed maps. The pages were filled with accounts from others who had gotten lost in the forest. Speaking of creatures and inexplicable phenomena, one entry in particular caught my attention. The forest is alive. It watches us. It tests us. Those who fail become part of it. That night, we heard voices whispering outside the cabin. They were human voices but distorted, as if they were speaking backward. No one slept. We stayed awake, armed with knives and flashlights, hoping the dawn would bring us some hope. Dawn brought a momentary relief, but we soon realized we were more lost than ever. The cabin, which had seemed like a refuge, now felt like a trap. The voices we heard during the night had vanished, but the silence that replaced them was even more disturbing. We decided to move on. but the forest seemed to close in around us, as if guiding us to a specific destination. After hours of walking, we reached a clearing where the ground was covered with a black, sticky substance. In the center stood a gigantic tree, unlike any I'd ever seen. Its roots stretched out like tentacles, and its trunk was covered in ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint light. It was then that we realized we were not alone. Humanoid figures emerged from the shadows, moving in a disjointed manner, as if they were puppets controlled by invisible strings. Their eyes shone with the same light as the symbols on the tree, and their mouths opened in silent screams. They slowly approached, surrounding us. One of my companions tried to run, but he was pulled to the ground by the roots of the tree, which moved as if they were alive. The last member of the group and I stepped back, but soon realized there was nowhere to escape. It was then that I heard a voice in my mind, soft and persuasive, saying, "Do you want to live? Then make a choice." I looked at my companion and saw the same terror in his eyes. Before we could react, he was pulled into the tree, which seemed to swallow him as if it were made of liquid. The voice returned, more insistent this time. "The forest demands a sacrifice. Choose wisely." I knew what this meant. The forest wanted me to give something in exchange for my life. Without thinking twice, I grabbed a knife and cut a piece of my arm, offering it to the roots of the tree. The pain was excruciating, but I immediately felt a sense of relief, as if the forest had accepted my offering. The humanoid figures retreated, and the tree began to withdraw, as if it were closing in. The clearing fell silent again, and I knew I'd been spared. I walked for hours until I finally found a path that led me back to civilization. When I arrived at the first village, people looked at me with suspicion, as if they knew I had brought something back from the forest with me. Today, years later, I still carry the scars of that experience, both physical and mental. The Amazon rainforest holds secrets that humanity is not prepared to understand. And I know that somewhere in there, the tree is still waiting, ready to claim more victims. When I finally reached the nearest village, I was exhausted, hurt, and traumatized. The villagers looked at me with a mix of curiosity and fear, as if they knew I had brought something back from the forest with me. An older man, who seemed to be the leader of the community, approached me and asked what had happened. I tried to explain, but the words seemed insufficient to describe the horror I had experienced. He took me to his home, where his wife tended to my wounds. As she applied herbs and bandages, the man told me stories about the forest. He spoke of an ancient legend that said the Amazon was guarded by ancestral spirits who protected the land from intruders. Those who disrespected the forest were punished, and many never returned. He looked me in the eyes and said, "You were chosen to return, but the forest will never let you go completely." That phrase echoed in my mind as I tried to recover. Days passed, and I began to notice strange things. At night, I heard whispers coming from the forest, as if the voices I'd heard before were calling me back. Vivid and disturbing dreams haunted me, showing images of the gigantic tree and the creatures that had pursued me. I would wake up sweating, feeling as if something was watching me. I decided I needed to leave as soon as possible, but the forest seemed unwilling to let me go. When I tried to take a boat to the nearest city, a sudden storm arose, forcing the boatmen to cancel the trip. I tried to go by land, but the roads were blocked by fallen trees and floods. It was as if nature itself was preventing me from leaving. It was then that I realized the forest had marked me. The scar on my arm, where I had made the sacrifice, began to hurt constantly, and I felt a constant presence around me. The people in the village started to avoid me, as if they knew I was carrying something evil. So the older man told me I needed to make an offering to calm the spirits, but I didn't know what else I could give. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I heard a noise coming from outside the house. When I looked out the window, I saw a tall, dark figure with eyes that glowed like embers. It was the same creature I'd seen in the forest. It stared at me for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, I found out that the older man had disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, but I knew the forest had claimed another victim. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I took what little I had and began to walk, ignoring the warnings of the villagers. I walked for days until I finally reached a larger city. There I received medical and psychological help, but nothing seemed to alleviate the weight I carried. The forest had changed me, and I knew I would never be the same. Even far from the Amazon, the forest continued to haunt me. I returned home, but the feeling that something was wrong never left me. The scar on my arm hurt constantly, and I began to see things that shouldn't be there. Shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers echoing in the silence of the night. It was as if the forest had left a part of itself inside me. I tried to resume my life, but it was impossible to ignore what had happened. I decided to write about my experience, hoping that by putting everything on paper, I could find some relief. But every word I wrote seemed to bring back vivid and painful memories. The people around me began to notice my change in behavior. I was distant, paranoid, always looking over my shoulder as if I was being followed. One night, while I was working on my account, I heard a noise coming from my backyard. When I looked out the window, I saw a tall, dark figure with eyes that glowed like embers. It was the same creature I'd seen in the forest. It stared at me for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, I discovered that my dog was missing. No one knew where he had gone, but I knew the forest had claimed another victim. I decided that I needed to confront what was happening. I returned to the Amazon, this time alone. I knew it was a dangerous decision, but I felt I had no choice. The forest was calling me, and I knew I had to respond. When I arrived at the village where I'd been helped before, the residents looked at me with fear and sadness. The old man had disappeared, and they knew I was involved. I walked to the clearing where I'd found the gigantic tree. This time, the forest seemed to guide me, as if it knew I was coming back. When I reached the clearing, the tree was there, larger and more imposing than I remembered. The roots moved like tentacles, and the symbols on the trunk glowed with an intense light. The voice in my mind returned, soft and persuasive. "You have come back. The forest is pleased." It was then that I understood the true meaning of sacrifice. The forest did not just want my flesh and blood, it wanted my soul. I had been marked, and now I was part of it. The humanoid figures emerged from the shadows, moving toward me. This time, I felt no fear. I knew there was no escape. Today, years later, I'm still here, trapped in the forest that haunted me so much. I write this account in the hope that someone will find it and understand the danger that the Amazon hides. The forest is alive, and it does not forgive those who disturb it. If you're reading this, know that not everything in nature is benign. Some secrets are better left untouched. This is the end of my account. The forest called me, and I answered. Now I am part of it, just like all those who came before me. May my story serve as a warning to those who dare to challenge the limits of the unknown. The Amazon holds mysteries that humanity is not prepared to understand, and I am just another victim of its wrath.
It was a cold October night in a small town in rural Texas. The local Walmart, known as the gathering spot for everyone in the area, was nearly empty. Most of the employees had already left, with only a few remaining to close up the store. As the assistant manager, I was in charge of making sure everything was in order before locking the doors. Around 10 p.m., as I was organizing the shelves in the electronics section, I began to feel a strange sensation that I wasn't alone. The silence of the place, which had once been comforting, now felt oppressive. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from the toy aisle. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I decided to investigate, thinking it might be a lost customer or an animal that had wandered into the store. As I approached the aisle, I saw something that left me frozen. A porcelain doll, one of those old, creepy ones, was sitting in the middle of the floor. Its eyes seemed to follow me, and its smile was disturbingly realistic. I tried to convince myself it was just a tasteless prank by a coworker, but something inside me knew it wasn't. When I reached out to pick up the doll, the lights in the aisle began to flicker, and a voice whispered my name. It was a soft, feminine voice, but it carried an energy I couldn't explain. I ran back to the checkout area, where two co-workers were finishing up closing the registers. I told them what had happened, but they just laughed, saying I was imagining things. However, when we went to check the toy aisle, the doll had disappeared. The atmosphere in the store had completely changed. The air felt heavier and the silence was almost deafening. We decided to close the store early and leave. As we walked toward the exit, I heard the voice again, this time clearer. "Don't leave yet." The next night, the Walmart was busier than usual. It seemed like everyone in town had decided to shop at the same time. I was busy helping customers, but I couldn't get the incident from the previous night out of my head. The doll, the voice, the feeling that something was wrong, it all haunted me. Around 9 p.m., the store began to empty out. I was in the clothing section, organizing some items, when I heard a noise coming from the appliance aisle. It was the same dragging sound I'd heard the night before. My heart raced, but I decided to face my fear and investigate. When I reached the aisle, I saw the porcelain doll again, but this time it was sitting on top of a refrigerator. Its eyes glowed under the fluorescent light, and its smile seemed even more sinister. Before I could react, the lights began to flicker, and the voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." I tried to move away, but my legs felt stuck to the floor. The doll began to move, its arms and legs creaking as if manipulated by an invisible force. It stood up and took a step toward me. That's when the lights went out completely and I was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the doll had disappeared again. I was trembling, but I knew I had to stay calm. I returned to the checkout area where my coworkers were chatting. I told them what had happened, and this time they seemed to take it seriously. One of them, named Mike, said he'd heard stories about a woman who died in the store many years ago, but he'd never paid much attention to them. We decided to investigate together. We grabbed flashlights and went to the storage room where the store's old records were kept. We found a document from 1985 that mentioned an employee named Clara who had mysteriously disappeared during the night shift. No body was ever found, and the case was never solved. As we read the document, we heard a noise coming from the back of the storage room. It was the sound of slow, dragging footsteps. Mike pointed the flashlight in the direction of the noise. There was Clara, or at least what appeared to be her. Her face was pale and distorted, and her eyes glowed with a supernatural light. She whispered, "You shouldn't have dug into the past." The storage room turned icy, and the air felt charged with a heavy energy. Clara, or whatever she was, began to move toward us. Her steps were slow but deliberate, and each one echoed, like thunder in the silent space. Mike and I backed away, but we soon realized we were cornered. "What does she want?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," I replied, trying to stay calm. Clara stopped a few feet away from us and extended her hand. In her palm was the porcelain doll, now cracked and with empty eyes. She whispered again, "You need to fix what was broken." It was then that we realized the doll was some kind of key to the mystery. Perhaps Clara was trapped in the store because of it, or maybe the doll represented something that had happened in the past. We decided to take the doll, even though we were afraid of what might happen. As soon as we touched it, a wave of energy hit us, and suddenly we were in a flashback. It was 1985, and we saw Clara working at Walmart. She seemed happy, but there was something dark in her eyes. We saw her hiding the doll on a shelf, as if she were trying to protect something. The flashback shifted, and now we saw Clara being confronted by a man who appeared to be the store manager at the time. They were arguing, and the man seemed to be threatening her. Clara tried to run, but he grabbed her and dragged her into the storage room. That's when we understood. Clara had been murdered, and her body had been hidden in the store. The flashback ended, and we were back in the present. Clara stood before us, but now her face seemed calmer. She whispered, "Find what he hid." Mike and I knew what we had to do. We began tearing apart the storage room, searching for anything that could be Clara's remains. After hours of searching, we found an old box buried under some shelves. Inside were Clara's remains, along with a photo of her holding the doll. We placed the remains in a dignified spot and burned the doll as a ritual to free her soul. As the flames consumed the doll, we felt a wave of relief, and Clara disappeared, finally at peace. The Walmart was never the same after that night. Mike and I grew closer, sharing the weight of what we'd experienced. The store continued to operate, but there was always a strange feeling in the air, as if Clara was still there, watching. In the days following the incident, the Walmart seemed quieter than ever. Employees whispered among themselves, and some even requested transfers to other stores. Mike and I decided to keep what happened a secret, knowing no one would believe us. However, small phenomena continued to occur. Lights flickered randomly, objects disappeared and reappeared in strange places, and sometimes in the silence of the night, Clara's whisper could still be heard. Despite it all, we felt she was no longer trapped, but rather watching, as if she wanted to ensure her story would never be forgotten. One night, as I was closing the store, I found a letter in my locker. It was written in an old-fashioned handwriting and said, "Thank you for freeing me. Now, protect what remains of me." The letter was signed with a stylized C. I kept the letter as a memento but never told anyone about it. Mike and I began to investigate more about Clara. We discovered she was a young single mother who worked at Walmart to support her daughter. Her daughter Emily had disappeared shortly after Clara's death, and no one knew what had happened to her. We felt that perhaps Clara was still searching for her daughter, even in death. We decided to look for clues about Emily. After weeks of research, we found an old orphanage where she might have been taken. There we learned that Emily had been adopted by a family that moved to another state. Unfortunately, she had passed away a few years earlier from an illness. When we returned to Walmart, we felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air felt lighter, and the supernatural phenomena stopped completely. It was as if Clara had finally found the peace she was looking for, knowing her daughter was no longer alone in the world. Mike and I continued working at the store for a few more months, but eventually, we went our separate ways. I moved to another city, while Mike started his own business. However, whenever we met, we reminisced about those nights at Walmart and what we'd learned about the power of forgiveness and redemption. The Walmart is still there, operating as usual, but I know Clara is still watching, not as a scary ghost, but as a protective spirit. Her story is a reminder that the past is never completely forgotten, and that sometimes we need to face our fears to find peace. Years have passed since the events at Walmart, but Clara's story has never left my mind. I decided to write a book about the experience, blending real facts with fiction to protect the identities of those involved. The book became a local success, and many people began visiting Walmart, curious to learn more about the legend of Clara. One day I received a letter from a woman named Sarah. She claimed to be Clara's granddaughter and wanted to know more about the grandmother she'd never met. I was moved by her message and agreed to meet her. Sarah was a vibrant young woman, with the same bright eyes Clara had in the photos we'd found. She told me her mother, Emily, had passed away when she was very young but always spoke fondly of Clara. Sarah wanted to know everything I knew about her grandmother, from the details of her life to what had happened that night at Walmart. We spent hours talking, and I shared everything I'd experienced. Sarah was amazed but also grateful to finally understand what had happened to Clara. She thanked me for helping to free her grandmother's soul and for keeping her story alive. Together, we decided to create a memorial for Clara at Walmart. The store's management, now under new leadership, agreed to dedicate a small plaque. In her honor, the plaque read, "In memory of Clara, a mother, a friend, and a protective spirit." On the day of the memorial's unveiling, Sarah and I were there, along with Mike and some former employees who had lived through the events. It was an emotional moment, and we felt Clara had finally found the rest she deserved. Since then, Walmart has had no more supernatural incidents. The store continues to operate normally, but Clara's story remains an important part of its history. For me, that experience was a lesson in the power of compassion, courage, and the importance of facing the past to move forward. Sarah and I keep in touch to this day, and she regularly thanks me for helping bring peace to her family. Clara may be gone, but her legacy lives on, not just at Walmart, but in the hearts of everyone who knew her story. Even after the memorial and the apparent closure of the chapter, something still felt incomplete. Sarah and I continued to correspond, and she told me about recurring dreams she had of Clara. In the dreams, Clara always whispered the same phrase, "There's still something that needs to be found." Intrigued, we decided to return to Walmart for one final investigation. This time, we weren't alone. Mike, who had retired, joined us, as did a friend of Sarah's who specialized in the paranormal. We arrived at the store at night, with the management's permission. They still remembered Clara's story. We started in the storage room where it had all begun. We used recording equipment and energy detectors, hoping to capture some sign of Clara. For hours, nothing happened. We were about to give up when we heard a noise coming from the toy section. It was the same dragging sound I'd heard that first night. We ran there and found a small wooden box hidden behind a shelf. Inside the box was a diary. It was Clara's, and in it, she detailed her life, her fears, and her hopes. In the last pages, she wrote about a treasure she'd hidden for her daughter, Emily, in case something happened to her. It was a small collection of jewelry and a love letter Clara had never had the chance to deliver. Sarah was emotional as she read her grandmother's words. She held the jewelry and the letter as if they were the greatest treasures in the world. That's when we felt a gentle breeze pass through us, and we heard Clara's whisper one last time, "Thank you, now I am complete." In that moment, we knew Clara had finally found the piece she'd been searching for. She was no longer trapped at Walmart, but free to move on. Sarah decided to donate some of the jewelry to a charity in Clara's name, keeping only the letter as a personal memento. The diary was published as a companion to my book, and Clara's story became even more widely known. Walmart continues to operate, but now it's a place of memory and respect. The plaque in Clara's honor was expanded, and many visitors leave flowers and messages in her memory. For me, this journey was proof that the past is never truly lost. It can haunt us, but it can also teach and guide us. Clara wasn't just a ghost. She was a woman, a mother, and a story that needed to be told. And so the cycle closed. Clara rested, Sarah found peace, and I learned that sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones that connect us to one another.
It was a cold autumn night in Ravenswood, a small town in the heart of Ohio. The wind howled fiercely, making the dry leaves dance across the deserted streets. The packaging factory, located on the outskirts of town, was the only place still, lit at that hour. Its name, Ravenswood Packaging, was written in faded letters on the rusted sign at the entrance. Most of the townsfolk avoided passing by there at night, especially after the stories that circulated about the place. I, Jonathan, was one of the night shift workers. I had started working there 3 months ago after losing my previous job. The pay was decent, and I needed the money to pay the bills. That night, as usual, I arrived at 10 p.m. for my shift, which would last until 6 a.m. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few cars scattered around. The air felt heavier than usual, as if something was looming over the place. As I entered the factory, I greeted the security guard, an elderly man named Frank, who always seemed on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He handed me my badge with a tense smile and muttered, "Be careful tonight, Jonathan. It feels strange." I laughed, trying to mask the discomfort his words caused. Frank always said things like that, but that night his voice sounded more serious. The interior of the factory was lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast strange shadows on the walls. The hum of the machines was constant, a low buzz that seemed to echo in my head. My workstation was in the packaging section, where I supervised a production line that packed cardboard boxes. It was monotonous work, but I was used to it. Around midnight, something began to change. The machines, which usually ran smoothly, started to malfunction. The noise grew louder, almost deafening, and the lights flickered more frequently. My coworkers, who usually chatted during the shift, became strangely quiet. I looked around and noticed that everyone had tense expressions, as if they were waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard the first sound, a low moan, coming from somewhere deep within the factory. It sounded human, but at the same time, it didn't. My heart raced, and I glanced at my coworker, Mike, who was standing beside me. He had heard it too. "What was that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't have an answer. The moan came again, louder this time, and it seemed to be getting closer. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed in the direction of the sound, with Mike hesitantly following me. The hallway leading to the storage area was dark, with only the faint beam of the flashlight illuminating the path. The air was icy, and I could see my breath forming small clouds of vapor. The moan stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then suddenly, I heard footsteps behind us. I spun around, pointing the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was no one there. "Let's go back," Mike said, his voice trembling. I agreed, but before we could move, something hit us. An invisible force pushed us against the wall, and the flashlight fell to the ground, extinguishing its light. We were left in the dark, hearing only the sound of our ragged breathing. Then a voice whispered in our ears, so low we could barely make it out. "You shouldn't be here," Mike screamed, and we ran back to the packaging section, where the other workers looked at us with panic-stricken expressions. "What happened?" one of the women asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to respond. Something was wrong in that factory, and I had no idea what it was. After the incident in the hallway, the atmosphere in the factory grew even tenser. The machines continued to malfunction, and the lights flickered irregularly, creating a sense of disorientation. The workers who had previously tried to ignore their fear were now clearly terrified. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply stood still, looking around as if they expected something horrible to happen at any moment. Mike and I tried to focus on our work, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone, but there were only shadows moving on the walls. The moan we had heard earlier didn't repeat, but the silence was almost worse. It was a heavy silence, as if the air was filled with something we couldn't see. Around 2 a.m., something truly strange happened. The machines stopped working abruptly, and the lights went out completely. We were left in total darkness, and the silence was absolute. Someone turned on a flashlight, and the flickering light illuminated the pale, frightened faces of the workers. "What's going on?" someone asked, but no one had an answer. That's when we heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and heavy, as if someone was dragging their feet across the floor. The sound grew closer, and I felt my heart beat faster. "Frank?" someone called, hoping it was the security guard, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped, just outside the door to the packaging section, and we all froze, waiting. The door creaked open slowly, its rusty hinges groaning. The flashlight was pointed toward the entrance, but there was no one there. Only a thick fog began to spread across the floor, advancing toward us. "What is that?" Mike whispered, his voice filled with panic. No one answered. The fog seemed alive, moving almost intentionally, and I felt an intense cold run through my body. Suddenly the lights came back on, and the machines turned on by themselves, making everyone jump in fright. The fog disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling of fear remained. "This isn't normal," one of the women said, her voice trembling. "Something is very wrong here." We decided to stick together, working in groups to try to feel safer. But the fear didn't go away. Every now and then, I would see something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving too fast to be human. Others reported feeling cold touches on their shoulders or hearing whispers in their ears. The factory seemed to be alive, and it didn't want us there. Around 4 a.m. the worst happened. One of the workers, a man named Tom, started acting strangely. He stopped working and just stood there, staring into nothing. "Tom?" I called, but he didn't respond. Then he started laughing. It was a low, joyless laugh that soon turned into a maniacal cackle. "He's possessed!" someone shouted, and everyone backed away. Tom stopped laughing abruptly and looked directly at me. His eyes were completely black, with no whites visible. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice distorted and guttural. Then he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. We rushed to help him, but when he woke up, he didn't remember anything. "What happened?" he asked, confused. No one could explain it, but we all knew something was very wrong. The factory seemed to be consuming us, and I had no idea how to escape. The shift wasn't over yet, and I didn't know if we could make it until dawn. The incident with Tom left everyone in shock. He was taken to the break room, where we tried to calm him down, but he kept trembling and muttering unintelligible things. The rest of us returned to work, but the tension was palpable. The machines continued to malfunction, and the lights flickered irregularly, creating a sense of despair. I couldn't concentrate, and my eyes were constantly searching for something. Anything that could explain what was happening. Around 5 a.m. the sun still hadn't risen, and the darkness outside the factory seemed even denser. The wind howled outside, and the windows rattled with the force of the gusts. That's when we heard the sound of knocking on the main door. We all looked at each other, hesitant. "Who could it be at this hour?" Mike asked, his voice filled with fear. Frank, the security guard, went to the door and looked through the peephole. He stood still for a moment, then turned to us with a look of terror. "There's no one there," he said, his voice trembling. The knocking continued, growing louder, as if someone was trying to break down the door. "What are we going to do?" someone asked, but no one had an answer. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, and the silence returned. We all stood still, waiting for something to happen. Then we heard the sound of laughter coming from the hallway. It was a low, evil laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. "This isn't real," I thought, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I looked around, I saw that everyone else was hearing the same thing. The door to the packaging section creaked open slowly, and the fog we had seen before began to spread across the floor again. This time it seemed denser, more alive. "We can't stay here!" Mike shouted, and we all agreed. We ran toward the exit, but the fog surrounded us, blocking our path. It was as if it was pushing us back into the factory. "What do you want from us?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty space. The answer came in the form of whispers, low voices that seemed to come from all around. "You shouldn't be here," they said, repeating the same phrase we had heard before. The fog began to close in around us, and I felt an intense cold run through my body. That's when I saw something moving in the fog. It was a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes that seemed to stare directly at us. It approached slowly, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. "This can't be happening," I thought, but I knew it was real. The figure reached out its hand, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward it. "Jonathan," Mike shouted, trying to pull me back, but the force was too strong. I was being dragged into the fog, and I knew that if I entered, I would never come out. With one last effort, I managed to break free and ran toward the exit with Mike and the others behind me. The fog tried to follow us, but somehow we made it to the parking lot. The sun was beginning to rise, and the light of day dispelled the fog. We looked back at the factory and saw that it seemed normal again, but we knew something horrible had happened inside. "I'm never going back there," Mike said, his voice filled with relief and fear. I agreed. I would never set foot in that factory again. But even so, I knew that night would never leave my mind. Something in that factory was alive, and it didn't want us there. And I had no idea what it was, or what might happen to anyone who decided to return. After that night, none of us went back to the factory. Mike, Tom, and the other night shift workers quit the next day, as did I. Frank, the security guard, disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he went, but we all suspected he had been taken by that thing that inhabited the factory. The police were called, but they found nothing wrong. The factory continued to operate, with new workers being hired for the night shift. But I knew something was wrong. A few weeks later, I started hearing stories. Stories of workers disappearing during the night shift, of machines operating on their own, of voices and laughter echoing through the empty halls. The factory was gaining a sinister reputation, and the people of Ravenswood began to avoid it. But the worst was yet to come. One night I decided to investigate. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about that thing that had almost taken me. I grabbed a flashlight and returned to the factory, determined to uncover the truth. The parking lot was empty and the factory seemed abandoned. The lights were off and the silence was absolute. I entered through the back door, which was unlocked, and began exploring the interior. Everything seemed normal, but I knew something was wrong. The machines were covered in dust, as if they hadn't been used in months. But I knew the factory was still operating. Then I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, pointing the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty space. There was no response. Then I heard the sound of laughter, the same laughter we had heard that night. It came from all around, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. I ran toward the exit, but the fog began to spread across the floor, blocking my path. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered in my ear. I spun around again and saw the dark figure approaching. This time, it was closer, and I could see its glowing eyes fixed on me. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to stand my ground. The figure stopped and reached out its hand as if inviting me to follow. I knew that if I did, I would never return. But at the same time, I felt a morbid curiosity. What was in that factory? What did that thing want? I decided to follow the figure, the flashlight trembling in my hand. It led me to the storage area where there was a door I had never seen before. The figure pointed to the door, and I knew I was supposed to open it. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door and stepped inside. What I saw inside left me in shock. It was a room filled with old photos and documents detailing the history of the factory. There were pictures of workers who had disappeared over the years, of unexplained accidents, of things no one had ever explained. And in the center of the room there was a strange symbol drawn on the floor, surrounded by extinguished candles. That's when I realized it. The factory wasn't just a scary place, it was a portal, a place where something from the other side could enter our world. And that thing, that dark figure, was the guardian of the portal. It didn't want us there because it knew that if we discovered the truth, we could close the portal. But it was too late. The figure was behind me, and I knew there was no escape. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered again, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward it. I tried to fight, but the force was too strong. I was being dragged into the portal, and I knew that if I entered, I would never come out. With one last effort, I managed to break free and ran toward the exit. The figure tried to follow, but I escaped. I left the factory and never went back. But even so, I knew that thing was still there, waiting for its next victim. The factory was shut down a few months later after a series of unexplained disappearances. The place was abandoned and no one ever dared to enter again. But I know that portal is still open, and that thing is still waiting. Years have passed since that night, but what happened at the Ravenswood factory never left my mind. The town, once quiet and peaceful, began to change. People avoided talking about the factory, but everyone knew something was wrong. Stories of apparitions, strange sounds, and disappearances continued to circulate, and the site was fenced off with barbed wire with no trespassing signs scattered everywhere. I moved to another town, trying to leave the past behind, but the fear never left me. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that dark figure and the fog that seemed alive. Mike, my co-worker from that night, also moved away, but he was never the same. He told me that sometimes he still heard laughter and whispers, even far from the factory. Tom, the man who had been possessed, disappeared without a trace a few months later. No one knew where he went, but I had my suspicions. One day, I received a call from an investigative reporter named David. He was writing a book about haunted places in the United States and had heard about the Ravenswood factory. He wanted to know if I was willing to share my story. I hesitated at first, but I decided it was time to face my demons. I agreed to meet him at a cafe in a nearby town. David was a young, energetic man, but I could see the seriousness in his eyes as we began to talk. I told him everything that had happened that night, from the moans in the hallway to the dark figure and the portal in the storage room. He listened intently, taking notes in his notebook. When I finished, he was silent for a moment, as if processing everything. "This is incredible," he finally said. "Do you think there's still something there?" I hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I wouldn't risk finding out." David decided to investigate on his own. He visited Ravenswood and spoke to the townsfolk who were reluctant to talk about the factory. Some told stories of strange lights at night, of the sound of machines running even when the factory was closed, and of a fog that sometimes appeared around the site. He also discovered that the factory had been built on top of an old Native American burial ground, which explained part of the mystery. Determined to uncover the truth, David decided to enter the factory. He called me the night he planned to do it, asking for my blessing. I tried to dissuade him, but he was determined. "If there's something there, the world needs to know," he said. The next morning, David disappeared. His team found his car parked outside the factory, but there was no sign of him. The police were called, but they found nothing. The factory was empty, as always. But I knew what had happened. That thing had taken him. David's book was never published, but his investigation left a legacy. The Ravenswood factory was demolished a few years later, and the land was turned into a park. But I know the portal is still there, buried beneath the earth. And I know that thing is still waiting, ready to take anyone who dares to get too close. To this day, I wonder if I did the right thing by telling my story. Maybe I should have let the past stay buried. But at the same time, I know the world needs to know. There are things in this world we can't explain, and there are places where evil is still alive. And the Ravenswood factory was one of those places. I never went back there, and I never will. But sometimes, when the wind blows hard and the shadows seem to move on their own, I still feel that cold in the depths of my soul. And I know that thing is still there, waiting. The demolition of the Ravenswood factory brought temporary relief to the town, but the evil that inhabited that place didn't go away. The park that was built on the site seemed peaceful at first glance, but the residents soon began to notice strange things. Children played and laughed during the day, but at night the park became deserted. People reported feeling a presence watching them, even when they were alone. Some said they heard faint laughter and whispers coming from the trees, while others swore they had seen a thick fog forming in certain areas of the park. I, Jonathan, continued my life away from Ravenswood, but the past always haunted me. I got married, had children, and tried to move on. But the memories of that night never left me. I knew the portal was still there, buried beneath the park, and that thing was still waiting. Years went by, and I thought perhaps the evil had been contained. But then, one night I received a call from Mike, my old co-worker. His voice was trembling, and he sounded desperate. "Jonathan, you need to come here. Something is happening in the park, something horrible." I hesitated. I didn't want to go back to Ravenswood, but I knew I couldn't ignore Mike's plea. I grabbed my car and drove to the town, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, Mike was waiting for me at the entrance of the park. He looked aged, with sunken eyes and a look of panic. "What's happening?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "You need to see for yourself," he replied, leading me into the park. The park was dark, with only the moonlight illuminating the path. The air was cold, and I could feel a strange energy around me. Mike took me to a spot where the grass was burned, forming a perfect circle. In the center of the circle, there was a hole in the ground, and a thick fog was rising from it. "The portal," I whispered, feeling a wave of terror wash over me. "It's open." Mike nodded. "I've seen things, Jonathan, things I can't explain. And I've heard voices whispering my name. I know that thing is trying to come out." We stood there, staring at the hole, unsure of what to do. We knew we couldn't close the portal on our own, but we also knew we couldn't leave it open. It was then that we heard the sound of laughter, the same laughter we had heard that night at the factory. The fog began to spread, and I saw the dark figure emerging from the hole. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered, its voice distorted and guttural. Mike and I ran, but the fog surrounded us, blocking our way. The figure approached, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward it. I tried to fight, but the force was too strong. I was being dragged into the portal, and I knew that if I entered, I would never come out. With one last effort, I managed to break free and ran toward the exit. Mike was behind me, but the fog caught him. I saw him being pulled into the hole, his expression of terror frozen on his face. "Jonathan!" he screamed, but I couldn't help him. The fog swallowed him, and he disappeared. I ran to my car and drove away from the park, my heart racing in my chest. I knew Mike was lost, and that thing was still there, waiting. The next day, the hole in the park was closed, and the authorities said it was just an accident. But I knew the truth. The portal was still there, and that thing was still waiting. I never returned to Ravenswood, and I never will. But sometimes, when the wind blows hard and the shadows seem to move on their own, I still feel that chill deep in my soul. And I know that thing is still there, waiting. And now, I tell my story to you, hoping that you will never go near that place. Because there are things in this world that we cannot explain, and there are places where evil is still alive. And the park in Ravenswood is one of those places.
It was a cold winter night in a small countryside town, where the silence was broken only by the wind whispering through the trees. The full moon illuminated the deserted streets, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls of the old houses. In one of these houses lived Eduardo, a middle-aged man who appeared ordinary, but harbored a dark secret. Eduardo was married to Mariana, a kind and devoted woman who had always supported him in everything. However, a few months ago, he had begun an affair with Clara, a mysterious young woman who had arrived in town without much explanation. Clara was beautiful, but there was something in her gaze that made Eduardo uneasy, something he couldn't quite define. That night, Eduardo was at home, trying to focus on a book, but his mind kept wandering to Clara. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't resist the fascination she held over him. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from the kitchen. Thinking it was Mariana, he got up to investigate. Upon entering the kitchen, he found Clara sitting at the table, an enigmatic smile on her lips. Eduardo froze, unable to understand how she had entered his house. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Clara slowly stood up and approached him. "I missed you, Eduardo. You haven't come to see me in days," she said in a soft voice that carried an implicit threat. Eduardo felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he needed to end this, but something about Clara prevented him from acting. I can't see you anymore, Clara. It's better if we end this," he said, trying to sound firm. Clara laughed, a sound that echoed through the kitchen like a funeral bell. "You think you can just discard me, Eduardo? You don't understand, do you? I'm a part of you now, and I'm never leaving." Before Eduardo could respond, Clara disappeared, leaving him alone in the kitchen, his heart racing. He looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the only thing he saw was Clara's shadow dissipating in the air. Eduardo knew something was very wrong, but he couldn't understand what. He decided he needed to uncover the truth about Clara, no matter the cost, but he had no idea what was coming. Eduardo spent the night awake, disturbed by the encounter with Clara. He tried to convince himself it was just a dream, a hallucination caused by stress. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Clara wasn't an ordinary woman, and he needed to find out what she really was. The next day, Eduardo decided to investigate Clara's past. He began by asking the older residents of the town, but no one seemed to know where she had come from. Some even claimed they had never seen her before. This only increased his unease. Determined to find answers, Eduardo went to the town's library, where he began researching old records and documents. It was there that he found something that chilled him to the bone. In an old book, he discovered the story of a woman named Clara, who had lived in the town over 100 years ago. The description matched the Clara he knew: beautiful, mysterious, and with a gaze that seemed to pierce the soul.
According to the book, Clara had been accused of witchcraft and condemned to death by the local community. She was burned at the stake on a full moon night, swearing vengeance against all who had betrayed her. Eduardo felt a cold shiver as he read this. Could the Clara he knew be the same woman? Could she have returned from the dead to seek revenge? With a heavy heart, Eduardo decided to confront Clara. He went to the cabin where she lived, a small hut on the outskirts of town. When he arrived, he found the door open and entered, calling out to her. "Clara, I'm here. We need to talk." Inside the cabin, the air was heavy and the smell of sulfur was strong. Eduardo felt a presence around him, as if he were being watched. Suddenly, Clara appeared before him, a sinister smile on her lips. "You've discovered the truth, haven't you, Eduardo?" she asked, her voice echoing like a whisper. Eduardo tried to stay calm, but fear took over. "What do you want from me, Clara? Why are you doing this?" Clara laughed, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. "I want what's mine, Eduardo. You betrayed me, just like all the others. And now you'll pay for it." Before Eduardo could react, Clara reached out and touched his face. He felt an intense pain, as if his body were being consumed by flames. Screaming in agony, he fell to the ground as Clara watched with a look of satisfaction. "You're mine now, Eduardo. Forever," she whispered before disappearing again. Eduardo was left alone in the cabin, his body trembling and his mind confused. He knew he was in danger, but he didn't know what to do. He needed to find a way to free himself from Clara before it was too late. Eduardo woke up in his own bed, drenched in cold sweat and with his heart racing. He looked around, expecting to see Clara in some corner of the room, but he was alone. The pain he had felt in the cabin was gone, but the memory of what had happened still haunted him. He knew he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Clara was real, and she was determined to destroy him. Determined to free himself, Eduardo decided to seek help. He went to the town's church, where he found Father Antonio, an elderly and wise man known for his knowledge of the supernatural. Eduardo told him everything that had happened, from the beginning of the affair with Clara to the encounter in the cabin. The priest listened attentively, a serious expression on his face. "Eduardo, what you describe is very serious," said the priest after a long silence. "Clara is not an ordinary woman. She is an evil entity, a spirit seeking vengeance. You became involved with her, and now she is bound to you." Eduardo felt a lump form in his throat. "What can I do, Father? How can I get rid of her?" The priest sighed, looking at Eduardo with compassion. "It won't be easy, but there is a way. You'll need to face her, but not alone. I'll help you, but you must follow my instructions precisely." The priest explained that to rid himself of Clara, Eduardo would need to perform an exorcism ritual. He would have to return to the cabin where Clara had attacked him, and with the priest's help, expel the evil spirit once and for all. Eduardo agreed, knowing he had no other choice. That night, Eduardo and the priest went to the cabin, carrying candles, holy water, and other sacred objects. The air was heavy, and the silence was oppressive. As they entered the cabin, they felt a malevolent presence around them, as if Clara already knew they were there. "Clara, show yourself," commanded the priest in a firm, authoritative voice. Suddenly, Clara appeared before them, her eyes filled with hatred and disdain. "You've brought help, Eduardo. Did you think that would be enough to get rid of me?" she said, her voice echoing like thunder. The priest began reciting prayers in Latin, sprinkling holy water toward Clara. She screamed in pain as if the water were burning her. Eduardo stood frozen, watching the scene with a mix of fear and hope. "You do not belong in this world, Clara. Return to where you came from," shouted the priest, his voice echoing throughout the cabin. Clara fought against the priest's words, but she seemed to be losing strength. Her body began to disintegrate as if consumed by an invisible flame. "You won't get rid of me so easily, Eduardo," she screamed before disappearing completely. The cabin fell silent, and the heavy air began to dissipate. Eduardo looked at the priest, tears in his eyes. "Is she gone?" he asked, his voice trembling. The priest placed a hand on Eduardo's shoulder. "Yes, Eduardo. Clara has been expelled, but you must learn from this. Evil always demands a price, and you almost paid with your life." Eduardo knew the priest was right. He had made a terrible mistake by getting involved with Clara, and he had almost lost everything because of it. He promised himself he would never again allow himself to be seduced by evil. Despite Clara's expulsion, Eduardo couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The nights were the worst. He would wake up sweating, the sound of laughter echoing in his ears, as if Clara were still there, watching him from the shadows. Mariana, his wife, noticed the change in him. He was distant, frightened, and she didn't understand why. "Eduardo, what's happening to you?" she asked one night as he stared out the window, as if expecting to see something outside. "You haven't been yourself lately." Eduardo hesitated. He wanted to tell the truth, but how could he explain something so absurd? How could he tell the woman he loved that he had betrayed her with an evil entity? He knew he couldn't keep it a secret forever, but the fear of losing her was greater than anything else. "It's nothing, Mariana," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "I'm just tired, that's all." Mariana didn't seem convinced, but she decided not to press him. She knew something was wrong, but she had no idea how deep the abyss Eduardo had fallen into was. Days passed, and the tension in the house only grew. Eduardo began to notice strange things, objects moving on their own, doors slamming for no reason, and sometimes he swore he saw Clara reflected in the mirrors, always with that sinister smile. He tried to ignore it, but he knew Clara hadn't truly left. She was still there, waiting. One night, while Mariana slept, Eduardo decided to face his fears. He took a candle and went down to the basement where he kept old belongings. There, he found a dusty box that had belonged to his grandmother. Inside, it was an old prayer book and a silver crucifix. He didn't know why, but he felt those objects could help him. As he held the crucifix, he felt a wave of calm, as if something were protecting him. It was then that he heard a noise behind him. He turned quickly and saw Clara, standing in the corner of the basement, her eyes filled with hatred. "You really think this will stop me, Eduardo?" she whispered, her voice seeming to come from all directions. "I'm a part of you now. You'll never get rid of me." Eduardo gripped the crucifix tightly, trying to stay calm. "You don't scare me anymore, Clara. I know what you are, and I won't let you destroy me." Clara laughed, a sound that echoed through the basement like thunder. "You're weak, Eduardo. You always were, and now you'll pay for everything you've done." She lunged at him, but Eduardo raised the crucifix, reciting a prayer he had read in the book. Clara screamed, as if she were being burned, and retreated. "This isn't over, Eduardo," she screamed before disappearing again. Eduardo was left, alone in the basement, trembling but with a sense of relief. He knew Clara was still there, but now he had a weapon against her. He could no longer run. It was time to face the evil head-on. Eduardo knew he couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. Clara was growing stronger, more present, and he couldn't continue living in fear of her appearing at any moment. He decided it was time to end it once and for all. With the crucifix and the prayer book in hand, he went to the cabin where it had all begun, determined to face Clara. The night was dark, and the wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself were warning him of the danger ahead. When he arrived at the cabin, Eduardo felt an intense cold, as if the air were charged with negative energy. He took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for what was to come. As he entered the cabin, he found Clara waiting for him, a sinister smile on her lips. "I knew you'd come, Eduardo," she said, her voice echoing in his mind. "You've finally decided to face your fate." Eduardo gripped the crucifix tightly, feeling the protective energy it emanated. "This ends here, Clara. I won't let you destroy me." Clara laughed, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You're funny, Eduardo. Do you really think you can defeat me? I'm stronger than you could ever imagine." Eduardo began reciting the prayers from the book, his voice firm and determined. Clara screamed in pain as if the words were burning her. She tried to approach him, but the crucifix kept her at bay. You do not belong in this world, Clara. Return to where you came from, Eduardo shouted, his voice echoing throughout the cabin. Clara fought against Eduardo's words, but she seemed to be losing strength. Her body began to disintegrate, as if consumed by an invisible flame. You won't get rid of me so easily, Eduardo, she screamed before disappearing completely. The cabin fell silent, and the heavy air began to dissipate. Eduardo fell to his knees, exhausted but relieved. He knew Clara had been expelled, but he also knew the scars she had left on his life would never fully disappear. When he returned home, Eduardo found Mariana waiting for him, her eyes filled with worry. Where were you, Eduardo? I was so worried. Eduardo looked at her, tears in his eyes. I had to face something, Mariana. Something I brought into our lives. But it's over now, I promise. Mariana hugged him, asking no questions. She knew Eduardo had been through something terrible, and she was willing to stand by him, no matter what. Eduardo knew the battle with Clara had changed him forever. He had learned that evil could hide in the most seductive forms, and that the choices we make could have terrible consequences. But he also knew that, with love and faith, it was possible to face even the greatest fears. And so, Eduardo and Mariana began to rebuild their lives, knowing that while the past could never be erased, the future was still in their hands.
It was a night like any other in Raccoon City. The sky was heavy with thick clouds, and the air carried a strange smell, like something burning. I was at the local newspaper office, finishing an article about the rising cases of violence in the Raccoon City. No one could have imagined that this would be the last night of normalcy we would ever experience. Around 9 p.m., reports started coming in about people acting strangely. Some said they were seeing individuals with severe injuries walking the streets, but they didn't seem to feel any pain. Others spoke of inexplicable attacks, as if people had suddenly gone mad. I decided to go out and investigate. When I reached the city center, the scene was chaotic. Abandoned cars, shattered windows, and screams echoing from all directions. That's when I saw the first zombie. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes glazed over. She moved awkwardly, but with a terrifying determination. As she approached me, I realized she wasn't alive. Her body was cold, and the stench of death was unbearable. I ran back to my car and called the newspaper office, but the line was dead. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. That's when I realized we were completely isolated. The streets were filled with these creatures, and they seemed to be multiplying by the minute. I decided to drive to the hospital, thinking I might find answers there. The journey was a constant struggle. I had to swerve around abandoned cars and avoid zombies that tried to throw themselves in front of my vehicle. When I arrived at the hospital, the scene was even worse. The place was overrun by these creatures, and the few survivors left were desperate, trying to protect themselves however they could. It was there that I first heard the rumor about the virus. Someone said, it all started in a secret lab run by the Umbrella Corporation, a pharmaceutical company with a significant presence in the city. The virus had supposedly escaped, infecting people and turning them into these monsters. But no one knew for sure. What I did know was that I needed to survive. I spent the entire night hiding in the hospital, trying to avoid the zombies and find a way out. It was one of the longest nights of my life. Every minute, I heard screams and moans, and I knew more people were being turned into those creatures. When the sun finally rose, the city was unrecognizable. The streets were filled with bodies, and the zombies seemed to be everywhere. I tried to find other survivors, but most had either fled or been killed. That's when I heard the announcement on the radio. The government had decided to contain the situation with a nuclear explosion. Raccoon City would be sacrificed to prevent the virus from spreading. I knew I had to get out of there, but I didn't know how. The roads were blocked, and the zombies were everywhere. That's when I found a group of survivors trying to escape. Together, we decided to try to reach the city limits before the bomb was detonated. The journey was a constant struggle. We had to face hordes of zombies, find supplies, and avoid military patrols trying to enforce the quarantine. But finally, we made it to the edge of the city. That's when we saw the flash in the sky. The bomb had been detonated. Raccoon City was destroyed, and with it, all the evidence of what really happened. The government denied any involvement with the virus and blamed the Umbrella Corporation for the disaster. But I know the truth. I saw what happened. And now, I'm here, trying to tell this story before it's too late. After the nuclear explosion, the world seemed to have stopped. The city I knew, with its bustling streets and everyday life, had turned into a radioactive wasteland. The flash of the bomb still echoed in my mind, and the silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the moans of the zombies. We, the survivors, were exhausted, traumatized, and, above all, distrustful. We knew the government wouldn't simply let the truth come to light. In the days that followed, we were taken to a quarantine camp outside the exclusion zone. There, we were subjected to endless interrogations. They wanted to know everything: what we saw, what we heard, who we encountered. But at the same time, it was clear they weren't interested in hearing the full truth. Any mention of the virus, the Umbrella Corporation, or the secret lab was quickly dismissed or labeled as a conspiracy theory. As a reporter, I knew I had to document everything. I hid notes in unlikely places, memorized details, and even recorded testimonies from other survivors on a recorder I managed to hide. But I soon realized we were being watched. Any attempt to contact the outside world was blocked, and those who insisted on talking about what happened in Raccoon City simply disappeared. One night, while trying to sleep in one of the overcrowded barracks, I was approached by a man who identified himself as a former Umbrella employee. He was scared, but determined to tell what he knew. According to him, the virus wasn't an accident. It was a bioweapon created by the corporation, and the government had known about it from the start. The nuclear explosion wasn't just to contain the outbreak, but to destroy the evidence that could incriminate them. Before he could say more, soldiers appeared and took him away. I never saw him again. That was the moment I realized that if I wanted to survive, I needed to be more careful. I started communicating with other survivors discreetly, sharing information and planning an escape. We knew we couldn't trust the authorities. They were more interested in protecting their secrets than helping the survivors. Finally, after weeks of planning, we managed to escape the quarantine camp. It was a risky escape, with chases and gunfire, but we made it to an isolated rural area. There, we split into small groups to avoid drawing attention. I decided to go alone, determined to find a way to expose the truth. In the months that followed, I traveled from city to city, trying to find journalists or activists willing to listen to my story. But it was as if Raccoon City had never existed. The news spoke of an industrial accident and a successful evacuation. But no one mentioned the zombies, the virus, or the bomb. It was as if the entire world had agreed to forget. Now, I'm writing this account in a safe place, far from the eyes of the government and Umbrella. I know my life is in danger, but I believe the truth needs to be told. Raccoon City wasn't just a tragedy, it was a crime, and those responsible must be held accountable. After months of running and failed attempts to expose the truth, I realized I couldn't rely solely on traditional media. The government and the Umbrella Corporation had tentacles everywhere, and any attempt to publish my story was quickly suppressed. That's when I turned to the internet, to the digital underworld, where the truth could still be shared, even if anonymously. I created a blog under a pseudonym, where I began posting fragments of what I had experienced in Raccoon City. At first, the posts were seen as fiction, horror stories created for entertainment. But as more survivors began to speak out, the blog gained attention. People from all over the world started questioning the official narrative, and the name Raccoon City began to echo in forums and social media. However, this attention also attracted enemies. My blog was hacked several times, and I received anonymous death threats. I knew I was being watched, but I couldn't stop. Every day, more survivors reached out, sharing their own stories and evidence. Photos, videos, leaked documents from Umbrella. It all started to pile up, forming a mosaic of irrefutable proof. One of these survivors was a former Umbrella scientist who had worked in the secret lab in Raccoon City. She agreed to meet me in person, but only under extremely secure conditions. When we finally met, she handed me a flash drive containing confidential documents detailing the creation of the T-virus, its nature as a bioweapon, and the government's involvement in covering up the disaster. With this evidence in hand, I decided to contact a group of independent investigative journalists known for their courage in exposing large-scale scandals. Together, we began compiling a comprehensive dossier on what really happened in Raccoon City. The work was meticulous and dangerous, but we finally managed to publish the report on an international website, out of reach of local authorities. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. The government vehemently denied the allegations, but the evidence was overwhelming. Protests erupted in several cities, demanding justice for the victims of Raccoon City. The Umbrella Corporation, now under intense scrutiny, saw its stock plummet and its executives investigated. But the fight wasn't over yet. I knew that even with the truth exposed, those in power wouldn't give up easily. They continued to try to discredit our sources and undermine our credibility. Some of the journalists involved in the case disappeared, and others were arrested on false charges. Now I live in constant motion, always one step ahead of those who want to silence me. But I don't regret anything. Raccoon City may have been destroyed, but its story served as a warning to the world. Corporate greed and government corruption can no longer be swept under the rug. With the publication of the dossier and the global exposure of what really happened in Raccoon City, the world began to wake up to a dark reality. The Umbrella Corporation, once an untouchable giant, was brought to trial. Executives were arrested, secret labs were shut down, and the company's assets were frozen. It seemed that, finally, justice was being served. However, the cost of this victory was high. Many of the survivors who spoke out were persecuted, intimidated, or even killed. I myself continued to be a target, living in the shadows, always changing locations and identities. Despite this, I felt that every day of struggle was worth it. The truth was out there, and people were starting to question the official narratives. One of the most poignant moments of this journey was when I managed to contact the families of Raccoon City victims. Many of them had never known what really happened to their loved ones. By sharing my stories and the evidence I had gathered, I was able to give them some peace, knowing that their family members weren't just numbers in a statistic, but people who fought until the end was a comfort to many. But the fight didn't stop at Raccoon City. As more information leaked, we discovered that Umbrella wasn't the only corporation involved in dangerous experiments. Other companies, many with close ties to governments, were developing bioweapons and conducting tests on unsuspecting populations. The case of Raccoon City was just the tip of the iceberg. I decided to expand my work, creating a network of informants and allies around the world. Together, we began investigating other suspicious facilities and exposing new scandals. Each discovery was a risk, but also an opportunity to prevent another tragedy like Raccoon City from happening. Now, years after the disaster, the legacy of Raccoon City lives on. The city may have been destroyed, but its story served as a warning to the world. People are more aware of the dangers of corporate greed and government corruption. Transparency and accountability movements have gained strength, and the pressure for real change has never been greater. I continue my journey, always on the move, always alert. I know the price of truth is high, but I also know it's essential. As long as there are people willing to fight for it, there will be hope for a better future. Years have passed since the fall of Raccoon City, but the scars of that tragedy are still alive. The city may have been reduced to ashes, but its story echoes as a warning to humanity. The truth we exposed about the Umbrella Corporation and the government's involvement changed the world, but it also revealed how deep corruption runs and how far the powerful are willing to go to protect their secrets. Despite the victories, the fight never ended. Umbrella was dissolved, but its tentacles still reach far. Former executives fled to countries without extradition, secret labs were transferred to other corporations, and new dangerous experiments continue under different names. The T-virus may have been contained, but other biological threats are being created in silence. I, like many other survivors, remain in the shadows. I live under false identities, always on the move, always alert. Every day, I receive new information. From anonymous sources, reports of corporate and government abuses that need to be exposed. The internet has become my primary weapon, but also my greatest risk. Every post, every leak can be traced, but I can't stop. The truth needs to be told. One of the most impactful moments of this journey was when I discovered that the T-virus wasn't the only umbrella project. There were others, even more dangerous, that could cause destruction on a global scale. With the help of allies, I managed to infiltrate an abandoned umbrella facility and recover documents detailing these projects. This information was leaked to the international press, causing a new political earthquake. But exposing these secrets also brought consequences. The network of survivors I had built was infiltrated. Some of my closest allies were captured or killed. I myself narrowly escaped several assassination attempts. Every day, the line between life and death grows thinner. But I can't give up. The fight is bigger than me. Now, I'm writing this account in a safe place, knowing it may be the last time I have the chance to share my story. The world has changed since Raccoon City, but there's still much to be done. Greed and corruption are still there, hidden, in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. This is my legacy, a message for those willing to continue the fight. The truth may be painful, but it's necessary. Raccoon City wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. And it's up to us to ensure that warning is never forgotten. Time has passed, and the world has kept turning. But the legacy of Raccoon City has never faded. The city may have been erased from the map, but its story has become a symbol of resistance and a warning for future generations. The fight that began with a group of desperate survivors has now turned into a global movement, with people from all corners of the world uniting to combat the corruption and greed that nearly destroyed humanity. I, now older and more tired, continue my journey, but I'm no longer alone. A new generation of activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens has taken up the cause. They're younger, more connected, and more determined than I ever was. They use technology to their advantage, exposing injustices and organizing protests on a global scale. The internet, once a minefield of risks, has become a powerful tool for change. One of these young people is Clara, a brilliant hacker I met a few years ago. She lost her parents in Raccoon City and vowed to dedicate her life to exposing the truth. With her skills, she managed to access secret servers of corporations and governments, leaking information that shook the world. Together, we worked to protect her identity and ensure her findings reached the public. Another ally is Marcos, a former soldier who defected after discovering his government was involved in biological experiments similar to umbrellas. He uses his training to protect activists and ensure information gets where it needs to go. His courage and determination are inspiring, and he's become a key figure in our network. But despite the progress, the risks remain high. The corporations and governments we are trying to expose haven't given up. They're smarter, more cautious, and more dangerous. With every leak, every protest, they respond with violence and repression. We know the fight is far from over, but we also know we can't stop. Recently, we discovered that a new corporation, Neo Umbrella, is rising from the ashes of the old company. They're using advanced technology and artificial intelligence to conduct even more dangerous experiments. This time, we're not alone. The network we've built is ready to face them, and the new generation of fighters is more determined than ever. Now, I'm writing this account in a safe place, knowing my journey is nearing its end. But I also know the legacy of Raccoon City will live on. The fight for truth and justice never ends, and as long as there are people willing to stand up to power, there will be hope. This is my final testimony, a message for those who will continue the fight. The truth may be painful, but it's necessary, and it's up to us to ensure it's never forgotten.
Here's the English translation of your text. My name is Carlos Henrique Santos. I'm 34 years old, and I never imagined I would survive what happened on that cursed island in the South Pacific. The plane I was traveling in crashed after a series of violent turbulences, and I was the sole survivor. I remember waking up on a deserted beach, surrounded by wreckage from the Boeing 747. My body ached in every inch, but I was alive. The island seemed completely isolated, with no signs of civilization. The trees around me formed a dense green wall, and the silence was deafening. On the third day after the crash, something strange began to happen. The sky, once blue and clear, started changing in a way I had never seen before. The moon, normally white and serene, turned into a blood-red disk, as if bleeding in the firmament. The sun, inexplicably, began to darken. It wasn't a normal eclipse. It was as if an invisible force was sucking away all its brightness, leaving a grayish, morbid hue in the air. That was when I heard the first sounds. They weren't natural. They were moans, dragging footsteps, a visceral noise that sent chills down my spine. The first zombies appeared among the trees, emerging like living nightmares. They weren't like the ones described in movies. They were something far more terrifying. Their flesh was in an advanced state of decay, yet they moved with supernatural agility. I quickly realized they weren't slow like in classic films. These zombies could run, leap, and seemed to possess a primitive intelligence. Their eyes were completely white, devoid of irises, and emitted an eerie green glow in the darkness. The hordes came in waves, first dozens, then hundreds. The sound of their movements was deafening, a mix of moans, bone creaks, and a guttural hiss that seemed to come from the depths of hell. My only refuge was a small cave on the slope of a rocky hill. I had with me only a survival knife I found in the plane wreckage and some limited supplies. Every night, the blood moon pulsed in the sky, as if watching my struggle for survival. The zombies surrounded my hideout, tightening their siege with each passing hour. On the fourth night, something truly inexplicable happened. The zombies began displaying behavior that went beyond a simple hunt for human flesh. They seemed organized, as if responding to some telepathic command. I saw leaders among them, larger creatures with strange markings on their bodies, coordinating the movements of the others. Their heads moved in sync, as if sensing something I couldn't perceive. The celestial phenomenon intensified. The blood moon now pulsed in such deep red tones that it bathed the island in a macabre glow. The sky seemed torn, with black fissures, opening between the clouds, as if reality itself was unraveling. My supplies were running low. I had only water from a nearby stream, and some fruits I could gather quickly during moments when the zombies were less active. One thing puzzled me. They appeared to have a hierarchy, an organization far beyond anything horror literature had ever described. Some carried remnants of military equipment, while others had bodily modifications suggesting something more than just an infection. The night was just beginning, and I knew it would be the longest and most terrifying of all. On the fifth night, the impossible happened. The zombies began using rudimentary tools. I saw some building a structure using debris from the plane wreckage and tree branches. It was as if they possessed a collective intelligence, a purpose beyond mere hunger. A zombie leader, larger and more deformed than the others, carried a metallic object that gleamed even in the darkness. It looked like a fragment of something technological, perhaps part of a scientific or military device. The sky remained apocalyptic. The blood moon now rotated slowly, creating hypnotic patterns that made me question my own sanity. Strange shadows danced on the rocky walls of my cave, forming figures that seemed to watch me. My physical endurance was at its limit. Old war wounds, remnants of my time as a soldier, began betraying me. Every movement was a battle against exhaustion and fear. The zombies seemed to be preparing something. Their movements hinted at a greater plan, something beyond mere survival. They arranged themselves in circles, performing bizarre rituals that resembled ancient tribal ceremonies, but with an indescribable horror. A deep sound began echoing across the island. It wasn't natural. It seemed to come from the depths of the earth, a roar that made the zombies move in perfect synchronization. On the sixth night, the true horror revealed itself. The zombies began a ritual that defied all logic of reality. The zombie leader, with his partially metallic, partially organic body, raised the strange fragment he carried. A dimensional rift began opening at the island's center. It wasn't a portal like in movies. It was a wound in the very fabric of reality. Indescribable creatures emerged, beings that belonged to no known scientific taxonomy. Then I realized my survival wasn't accidental. Something was keeping me alive on purpose. I was an observer, perhaps even a necessary element in this cosmic transformation. The metallic fragment at the ritual's core pulsed with a greenish-blue energy, creating waves of spatial distortion. The zombies moved. In a macabre dance, their bodies merging and separating in ways that defied human comprehension. The blood moon now covered the entire sky, transforming into an organic membrane that pulsed like a giant heart. The sun had vanished completely, replaced by a darkness that had a life of its own. My mind struggled to grasp what was happening. Was this the end of humanity? An invasion from another dimension? Or something far beyond our understanding? The zombies looked at me simultaneously, not with hatred, but with silent recognition. The dimensional rift pulsed with an energy that tore reality itself apart. The zombies surrounded me, not to attack, but as if I were part of something greater. The zombie leader, a creature blending alien technology with rotting flesh, reached out toward me. In that moment I understood. I wasn't just a survivor. I was chosen. A greenish metallic energy began enveloping my body. My consciousness expanded beyond human limits. I saw fragments of parallel realities, dimensions existing beyond earthly comprehension. The zombies weren't just the undead. They were heralds of a cosmic transformation, messengers of a mutation transcending human existence. The blood moon dissolved. The rift roared with thousands of simultaneous voices. My body began changing, not into a zombie, but into something entirely different. When the light finally faded, I was no longer Carlos Enrique Santos. I was something new, something that would witness the dawn of a new era. The apocalypse wouldn't be an end. It would be a rebirth.
My name is Sarah Martinez, and I never thought I'd be writing these words in such a devastated world. The Nevada desert, once an arid and silent place, is now our last refuge against the zombie apocalypse that has wiped out nearly the entire population of the United States. The abandoned military base, where we hide, feels like a survival capsule amid total chaos. The thick concrete walls protect us, but they can't silence the sounds of the infected wandering outside. Every noise makes me shudder. Jake, a former soldier turned our unofficial leader, keeps constant watch. His eyes, always alert, carry a pain I recognize all too well. We are two professionals, healthcare and warfare, respectively, trying to make sense of this nightmare. Supplies are running low. Our stock of water and food dwindles with each passing day, and I know we'll soon have to venture out on a reconnaissance and scavenging mission. The risk is immense, but the alternative is simply waiting for death. Today was tense. In the morning, we detected suspicious movement near the base. 3 zombies tried to approach, but we neutralized them without much trouble. Sarah was by my side, her gaze focused, gripping a shotgun with determination. Tensions within the group are rising. Carlos, a former truck driver, had a violent argument with Maria, our communications expert, over the distribution of the last supplies. We must stay united, or we'll be destroyed before the zombies even reach us. Sarah has been tirelessly working in her makeshift lab. She believes she can develop some kind of treatment or vaccine. I admire her hope, but I also know the cruel reality of this world. I've seen things that make me doubt salvation is even possible. At night during my watch shift, I spotted something unusual on the horizon. A distant glow. It didn't look like a zombie or a fire. Something tells me we're not alone. We must be ready. Any movement could mean our salvation, or our doom. The glow Jake mentioned left me uneasy. I spent the night analyzing blood samples from the infected, searching for clues about the virus's origin. My fingers tremble as I write. Not from fear, but exhaustion and frustration. I discovered something interesting today. The viral mutations don't follow conventional scientific patterns. It's as if the virus has a mind of its own, adapting rapidly to any containment attempt. My medical colleagues would have been fascinated by this discovery. If they were still alive, Jake watched me work. I noticed his tired gaze, marked by invisible scars from past battles. He doesn't talk much about his military days, but his movements reveal years of training. At lunch, a rare moment of calm, Carlos began telling stories of his life before the apocalypse. A wife and 2 children he hasn't seen in months. Silent tears rolled down his face as he spoke. In moments like these, we realized the virus didn't just destroy bodies, it destroyed hope. In the afternoon, Jake organized a defense drill. Every group member must know how to fight, not just against zombies, but against potential human threats. The world has become a place where survival depends on quick reflexes and brutal decisions. Something tells me our greatest trial is yet to come. Hell finally knocked on our door. At 1437, a group of hostile survivors surrounded our base. They weren't zombies, but humans just as dangerous. 5 modified military vehicles, heavy weaponry, and a determination only those who've lost everything can possess. Sarah was by my side when the first shot hit our perimeter. Her expression changed instantly. No longer the compassionate doctor, but a warrior determined to protect our refuge. I quickly distributed weapons, organizing our makeshift defense. Carlos revealed surprising skills. A trucker turned sharpshooter, guarding the base's west flank. Maria, our communications expert, jammed the invaders' radio signals, creating a dead zone. The battle lasted exactly 47 minutes. We lost 2 of our own, Robert and Elena. Their bodies were buried quickly, without ceremony. In this world, grief is a luxury we can't afford. During the fight, something caught my eye. One of the attackers wore a modified military insignia. I recognized the symbol. They were survivors from a special unit that was supposed to have been wiped out weeks ago. Sarah found documents on the invaders' remains. Something about secret experiments. Something that might explain the virus's origin. Her eyes shone with a mix of fear and scientific excitement. At night, the silence is scarier than the battle. We know we're not alone anymore, and that could be either a blessing or a death sentence. The recovered documents are disturbing. They're not just records. They're evidence of a military bioengineering project called Project Lazarus. Partially burned pages reveal genetic experiments aimed at creating soldiers with regenerative abilities. Jake spent the night analyzing the documents with me. His usually stoic face showed signs of shock. Some notes suggest the zombie virus wasn't an accident. It may have been a deliberate result of military research. We found geographic coordinates in one document, a secret research facility in the Utah mountains. Could this be our next mission? The risk is enormous, but the possibility of answers pulls us like a magnet. Carlos is preparing the vehicles. We've reinforced the armor with metal plates scavenged from the base. Our supplies are limited, but our determination is endless. Every mile traveled could mean the difference between extinction and hope. This afternoon, a moment of vulnerability. Maria confessed she lost her entire family. Her once bright eyes are now wells of silent pain. In this post-apocalyptic world, emotional survival is as challenging as physical survival. Jake looks at me differently now. Not as a colleague, but as a war partner. Our fates are intertwined by something greater than mere survival. Dawn approaches. Utah awaits us.